Hey everybody, thank you for making the time to be here. Thanks to Wendy and to Abby for including me in their show. I appreciate that. And I have to say, just the meetings that we've had kind of in preparation for this was, obviously kindred spirits, and I just appreciate that opportunity to just freely exchange ideas, and so thank you. I grew up in southwestern Kansas. Youngest of 5 children. Spent the first year of my life on a farm, which I don't remember. My parents divorced. My mother left with 5 children to the next biggest city in southwestern Kansas, 1961, if you can imagine. So I've just been kind of writing notes to get ready for this. I've thought a lot about my mom, and I just, the courage for her to have done that. Remarried a few years later, then, 4 or 5 years after that, divorced. And I think what I learned from my mom is, one, that she was just a very incredibly resourceful person, resilient, romantic. I mean, she was so many wonderful things, and I think I owe a lot to whatever I am to her, certainly. And I think Kansas too instills a certain appreciation for the unadorned. And I think you have to, as a group, you had to make it happen because it wasn't going to be, there just weren't a lot of entertainment. So we wanted yeah.
I'm Kansas girl.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
I get it.
A lot of wind. But I didn't really know the wind was a thing. I went telling back. And I thought, man, the wind blows all the time. There was an AMW in our neighborhood, and at that time they had like Mama Burger, baby. They had these statues on top of the drive-thru. And I remember it's like, those were always blowing off the top of the restaurant. The wind did blow. I had nothing to compare it to. So that was, that's kind of the basics. I mean, drawing was something that I just always could do. It was just a natural thing. I was athletic, so it was football, boxing, wrestling, and drawing. And I was not a very good student. I was, sit in class and just stare at the playground or be drawing. But I had wonderful teachers that were very patient. And with my parents' divorce, I had some wonderful teachers step up and just made all the difference in my life. So anyway, I'm forever grateful to them for those little nudges, And I always remind, my wife was a teacher for 20-some years, elementary school, and she's thinking, I should be cleaning the environment, I should be doing these different things. And I think you have no idea. Don't ever underestimate what's a tiny little deflection can mean to a young person, because I have certainly been beneficiary of that care. So that's kind of that's laying the groundwork for me. that's my basis.
Well, it has been a real pleasure to work together, and I first saw Juel's work way back when I first moved here from New York in like 1994, 95, and at Frameworks Gallery, I was working at Frameworks, and he had a show there, and I was like, bang, this guy's got it going on, And so I really felt moved by the work since then, and I've been aware of you as an artist ever since that time. It's interesting because my experience too is that I came to art at a really early age, and my mother, who's right here, tells me that I used to cry because I couldn't draw things the way they looked when I was like 4 years old. I was really frustrated. It's like, dang, I should be able to do this. But once bitten by the art bug, I think my experience is that I sort of like never recovered from that in the way that experience at a really early age of just getting completely immersed in whatever it was that I was doing was so compelling that I could never let it go. So although I have done a lot of different things in my life, they've all been related to art, So I moved to New York City when I was 20 years old from San Francisco to be involved really in singing, dancing, acting, and art, so I've only been involved in the creative arts my entire life. I could never really take anything else seriously, and it left me with like, oh, how am I gonna do this kind of thing, like how do you do that when that's your compelling desire? But I never really did anything else except for offshoots of that. So I was an executive director of a nonprofit arts organization that did art for youth at risk, recognizing that it was art that had been my home as a young person, as a youth at risk. And so I provided those opportunities for other people, and I've always seen that value of the creative process for everybody, like in any way, whether you're an artist or not, the whole notion of kind of suspending the judgmental part of your brain and kind of getting into the flow of art has just been so fundamental to everything that I hold dear. And I'm so fortunate that I've been able to do my own work and really focus on my own work for the last 6 years or so, just really focusing on my own work. And in this pandemic, so fortunate, because really how I spend my days anyway is sitting in my studio doing my work. And I think that getting art making from kind of this place of, it's what I want to do all the time, but then I have to do all these other things to make a living, be a waitress, like do all the other things that I've done, to the place that now I am so fortunate in my life that I get to go to my studio and I spend my time working. And that's just the rhythm of my life. It's like I can't imagine doing anything else. So the work is a labor of love, and I think that the title, for us, Streams of Consciousness, but then Reconciling the Muse, for me, Reconciling the Muse is really, this muse has been with me my whole life, and it just never lets me go. It really never lets me go. And I'm so fortunate that I get to now give in to, the language and the vision of that muse.
So what's next?
We have questions for each other. Yes?
Well, we had talked, or our last conversation, last meeting, and you touched on, this is maybe thinking too far ahead, but I think it'll lead back into kind of, if you're interested in music and dance and acting, those kinds of things. But you talked a little bit about that you were a painting maker, and then ultimately wound up, you're a sculptor. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that that transition and what kind of moved you in that direction.
Yeah, it's thank you for that question, because it is, I think it's interesting. My own experience was, I grew up drawing, and then I think that the expectation of that is that you just go to painting, like surely that would be next. And there's also something about painting that's kind of, I don't know, it's like this lofty, exalted sort of ultimate art form. Really it's illusion. A lot of it's illusion. If you, like me, have a obsession with depth and space, it was all about illusion, trying to create depth and space on a two-dimensional picture plane. And I started drawing the figure when I was 15. I lived in Claremont, and there was Scripps College, and they had a art program. And I, in high school, would go over there and draw the figure, and I got extra credit, for drawing the figure. So I had a really figurative background, but I felt like I really needed to understand abstraction, to take myself seriously as an artist in, the end of the 21st century. If I didn't get abstraction, I just felt like I couldn't, I had to somehow get it. And so when I was in college, I went to Hunter College City University of New York, which was very abstract. And I had studied at the Art Students League, so I had this like really figurative orientation from that. And so I thought a lot about what I loved about the paintings that I was doing. And it was this kind of sense of structure, like almost a skeletal structure that I loved about the body, like the the body in space with the skeleton kind of doing this thing, and then the lines of tension from the muscles, attaching to the skeleton. So when I was trying to understand abstraction, the logical thing for me was to build this like really weird sculpture that isolated all those things. So I took string and I tied it off to this exterior armature. So I had a structure that I tied off with all these angles of like yarn. And then I wrapped the yarn in plaster bandage material. And then I tied it all up with cheesecloth. So I made this sort of really weird skeletal structure that had all these things that interested me. And then I painted it. I painted it like it was a still life.
You painted on
a separate thing. It's like I was looking at this sculpture that I had made, right?
Yeah.
And I was painting it. And initially I painted it sort of literally like I would paint a figure. So with a top and a bottom and a base and all this kind of stuff. And I painted it literally, and then I began to sort of look into the abstract space and starting to paint pieces of it like it wasn't just a literal figure form. And I had taken a sculpture class, and the sculpture teacher was like, "Are you sure you're not a sculptor?" Kind of thing like that. And from being a painter to a sculptor, it was really when Abby asked me to do a show. I had exhibited one piece of work in a show of hers, and she asked me to do a solo show. And I was like, "Oh, it's been years and years and years since I've done my own work. What am I going to do?" And somewhere in that process of creating that body of work, I went, "Oh my God, I'm a sculptor." and ever since then, it was really liberating. It was really liberating. And like you, I've never gotten the rectangular picture plane. And I think that was one of the things that really bothered me when I was painting, was I was like, why the rectangle? It feels really confining and weird, and why would I want to deal with that? I want to deal with this over here and this over here. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah. That's a good arc.
Yeah, so that's how I started. I sculpted to paint, and then I decided to do away with the painting, I guess. So my question for you is that, so I look at the work here, and you refer to the elliptical form, and again, I feel really sympathetic with the idea of exploding the picture frame. And yet in the artist statement, you don't have any reference to the egg. In a couple of these, because the materials, it's eggshell. So what is the reference to an egg? And is it purely an elliptical form for you, or is there a reference to the content of egg?
Well, I think of, I guess I think of more of the form. I think maybe some of that is a reflex to the first bit that I did, the first time I drew on an egg, shopping for a gift from my mom for Christmas. I was wandering from store to store. We're in this Asian import place, just like this jumble from floor to ceiling. And there was a little case with an egg in it, with a painting of a bird on a cherry blossom branch. And I got it. Took that home, took that egg out, fished one out of the dozen in the fridge and blew that out. And I drew a portrait of my great-grandmother, my mother's, and gave that to her for Christmas. The case was beautiful, and anyway, why these things happen, I have no idea, but it was just that immediately, without even thinking, just this somehow recognition. So the egg, it's just been this seduction at that point as I look back that I couldn't explain. I didn't understand that. It's like I would do other things. I would experiment with different media, and it just kept kind of pulling me back. And and some of it is, I think, people would look at me cross-eyed when I would tell them I draw on eggs. That they're just, I could see this vision of them. Easter eggs, that kind of thing. No, it's not like that at all. So I think maybe, I resist, calling it an egg. To me, it's just become yeah, the elliptical sphere, and so over time, obviously something I've thought about a great deal, and but and I've considered a sphere, and it's just not happening. I mean, to me, a sphere is form reconciled. I mean, it's that's where everything wants to be around, essentially. And the elliptical sphere, the egg is like form in the state of becoming. There's an energy to it. And also, if when you're drawing on that shape, unless you're just going around the equator, going attitudinally, the arc is always changing. So it's a different degree of change. So there are just so many things that are. I can see now why that was just such a seductive form for me. And again, I was always had this restlessness with rectangular plane, always bumping into the edges of something, and you want to keep drawing. And then it was that was a perfect place to go because I could just keep going, and just to intertwine and braid the imagery. So it was ideal for me. And we started off with chicken eggs, and I was in a grocery store, and we lived in Greeley at the time, and I'm pulling the eggs out, and I'm selecting like 6, and this old farmer behind me had been watching apparently. He goes, he says, "So what can you tell by looking at an egg?" I said, "I'm not shopping for my breakfast. It's like," and I tried to explain to him what I'm doing.
He's like, "Son, it's just an egg."
Dude, just pick them
An
out.
egg, it's not an egg, it's got to be an egg.
So I transitioned, I discovered duck eggs. People, found out what I do, and then all these eggs start coming. But I had aunts send me a carton of duck eggs, and they're heaven. I mean, it's just they tend to be symmetrically elliptical, so there's not a small end, and the surface is just vellum-like. It's beautiful to draw on. So that was kind of a step in that direction, and then ultimately I've started casting my own subcasts. So most of these are porcelain. So yeah, that's kind of the.
So in your bio, you state that you chose not to study formally art because you felt that you could get everything that you needed from your own exploration. And so, and I did that as well, but then I also finally wound up getting a BFA and blah, blah, blah. And so I was wondering, what are, in your experience, are the pros and cons of that?
Well, I think obviously there were so many things that I learned the hard way that I'm sure were common knowledge to people who had attended art school, that kind of stuff. But I really, as I've been thinking about that decision, it almost wasn't a decision. I mean, I went to college, went to UNC for like 3 months, 1 quarter, and dropped out. But I mean, the classes I took, economics, anthropology, and philosophy. Econ and Phil.
Snore.
It was the best. It was absolutely the best. I loved it, but I just never even considered taking an art class. And I think, I don't know if there are ultimately this. Looking back, I don't know if there are any cons. I mean, I felt that the things that I learned, even though I didn't know that they were already known, the things that I learned were like somehow intrinsically mine. It's like they were more embedded into, what I was trying to pursue or figure out. And I love that. I mean, that's still what happens. And I still, I don't know, it's a bit of an island, a monastery of one's own pursuit or endeavor, and I think that's just I don't know. There's something that with that intimacy, it also you're tapping into something that's universal. There's this paradox there where I think if you do something that's very internal, that also has this broader perspective. That I think I don't know, the micro and the macro. I mean, it's one or the seeds of the other will be found in the other. So yeah, so I'm thankful for that. I just flying by the seat of my pants, and I just I think again I kind of go back to my mom as far as this restlessness. I mean, once second divorce, year or two in Kansas still, and then we started moving, and we just never stopped moving. It was unsettling, and I think I have that same. It's a different kind of restlessness. It's an artistic restlessness where you never. There's never been that feeling necessarily of a rival, or if there is a rival, if there's satisfaction, it's fleeting, And I there's always a stick prodding you going, what else you got? That kind of thing. So yeah, the first figurative stuff of yours that I saw was before your show at the Fine Arts Center with Delane. And to the transparent figures, which I just love that idea, and being able to see-through form is just a whole other, and the shadows that the casts are different. I mean, there's a whole other thing going on there. But then, there's the element of, the element of the fabric is almost like a medium unto itself, but you've also woven those two together. And I was just curious as to, did those come parallel, or did one kind of give rise to the other? Or
You mean the
use of fabric in your pieces?
It's interesting because my first show here, big show here in the Springs, was back in 1997, and I did a show at the UCCS Gallery of Contemporary Art, and I brought out some of my paintings from New York City that were in that show, but I did this huge fabric installation, and it was this great big fabric installation that you could get inside of and sit inside of, and there was actually a soundtrack of our oldest son, Aiden, was like 18 months old at that time, and he was like taking a bath and babbling away, and I put a soundtrack of him in there, and you could just kind of get in there and be inside this space that was all this fabric, just like stretched and taut, and I had like teepee poles, some friend of ours that had teepee poles, and I used them to sort of create these great angles, and there was these 17-foot high ceilings, and I had been using fabric. My first installation experience in New York City was Art in the Anchorage, which is a biennial show in the anchorage of the Brooklyn Bridge, the anchorage of the Brooklyn Bridge was designed to be an open air market, and there were 60-foot tall ceilings in there. And so an organization named Creative Time sponsored art installations in there every other year, and I was part of that with Women's Action Coalition, which was a political action group that was formed in response to the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill thing, back in 1992. Okay, that's how old I am. So I created an installation for that was all using fabric, and I just always used fabric. And so when I did this fabric installation up at UCCS, Jerry Rigg, the curator there at the time, referred to me as a fiber artist, and I was like, oh, I'm not. I never thought of myself as a fiber artist. But I love fabric, and I always have. I mean, even, my grandmother smocked me dresses when I was a little girl, hand English smocking, these gorgeous little dresses. And I just love fabric and what it can do. And because you can transform an entire room with fabric, and it costs nothing, and it takes no technology. And I think a big part of my work also, and this is what I call sort of my female sensibility, but I'm really not into high-tech stuff that's like welding and, I'm like fabric and paper and we're good, I don't see any reason why you can't make really formal sculpture with, materials that are really user-friendly. And I've never had any money as an artist, so there's also that too, that I've never, casting in bronze and all this other kind of stuff. But, to me, a bronze figure is why would you want to do that? The figure is not bronze. It's like sinew and guts and skin and light, and bronze just doesn't feel right to me. So So fabric has always been something that's really interested me, and I love doing the packing tape forms, which was that. And that was just an idea that, Chris and I kind of came up with on the fly, and turned into this real obsession for a while. But from that, I think I began to get the possibility of, hollow forms. And as I began to think about developing the work that I'm doing now, for me, sculpture is like, well, you got this outside, which is what you see, but what's the inside all about? Like, the inside is just there to support the outside. What is that, wasted space? It's just this solid thing that just allows you the exterior. Well, what if you hollowed it out? Then you'd have this inner palette and this outer palette. You could do something on the inside that related to the outside, but that was unique, kind of like, like we are, sort of like human beings have this inner life and we have this outer life. And I just got really interested in that. And then also the lightweightness of it, especially when dealing with human form, because I guess for me, the body is all about motion, and that's definitely my dance background kind of coming in, but just the possibility of motion in space is better represented to me in fabric than it is in, like bronze or stone. So, so I think those two things, with the fascination in fabric in and of itself, because I think it's so beautiful. And I feel that way about paper too. It's so beautiful, I don't want to draw on it, I'd rather sculpt with it. And I feel that way about fabric. It's so beautiful in and of itself, and the way that it allows for all of that draping and motion. You can just move a little piece of fabric, and you can just, again, express that like rib cage kind of doing its thing, So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good.
So I have one more question for you, and that's, what else would you like to say about your work? Is there anything else that has not been covered that you would like to share?
There's one thing that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and it kind of, I guess, to me, I kind of see that element or that thread kind of running through the work that I've done. I just had this idea of, I don't know, at some point in life, maybe at conception, when we were born, before we were born, there was this, I think this idea of being whole. And I think somehow, at least my own experience, I think life, the experiences, environment, all of that has a way of fracturing, becomes these different passages. And I think when you're young and trying to figure that out, you don't realize maybe that it's coming apart in certain ways. So I feel like there's been this, maybe and it kind of comes back to reconciliation and resolution. So I think maybe some of what I'm doing is trying to put things back together. And I'm thinking of some of the drawings on the eggs. I mean, maybe the lines as being the thread, and the form is kind of the whole fabric. So it's kind of with the broken eggs. I mean, the first one I did of those was just shortly after 9/11, and it's like, what does it matter what I do in the realm of things? But somehow, I mean, I had broken eggs that I hung onto, so I started putting those back together, and it was a very, kind of a nurturing, like a better word, kind of a mothering thing to do, just something that I could care for, maybe try to reconcile in my own small way. And I think I really see that same kind of thing in a lot of what I do, is like trying to put something back together, and not like, I've had a very blessed life in so many ways. But yeah, it's a curious thought to me as far as, and just an offshoot of that just a bit, the panels, which are just around here, where the hell that came from. It's just, again, kind of a restlessness with rectangular form. So, I've made something where I could rotate each panel, and afforded me the independence to, I could draw one study, be in this state of mind here, and I wasn't obliged to draw in that same way over here. So it gave me this liberty from point to point. But I also thought, I mean, you're driving down the road, listening to the radio, I mean, maybe two different songs come on, you're seeing this, that. I mean, the whole thing is just these fragments of, all of this is coming at you, all this stimulus that you're not even aware of. And today, my God, even more than ever. So I think that was really a response to, that kind of input, that kind of stimulus, and trying to manage that. That to me seemed more of a, an accurate portrayal of life, rather than, it's all there, it's sitting still for you. Nothing sits still for you. Yeah, I mean, the light's changing, you're changing, my perception's changing. I mean, and so I just decided to start, drawing and trying to render that the transience of things. I thought, well, that's really uncomfortable, but I also thought that's more real than the other. But it's interesting that we try to, we try to fix something, freeze it in time, a portrayal, and say, that's what that is. And that's not the way it is. But I find, it's that constant dialogue that I'm having as I'm working. It's like I'm still, drawing borders and edges, and this begins here, and this, departs from that point. So it's wild. That's just kind of somehow in there, and yet, why is it there? Because that's just not the way it's happening. Yeah. So that's kind of those two veins, kind of the transience of things, and trying to stitch together, the barrage of stimulus, and maybe trying to reconcile, to resolve those kinds of things.
I think, one thing I'm really aware of is I'm so not done with the figure, and a cousin of mine who's also an artist, suggested one time that maybe, some of my detail, my anatomical detail might even detract from, the pure expression of a posture, a gesture. And I've thought about that, and I love abstract figurative work where it's just, there's like, you take the idea of a form in motion and you push that and sort of, maybe delete some of the anatomical detail to just suggest, more of a completed motion, and I some part of me would love to kind of get there someday, but I feel like, my romance with the figure has gone back a long time, but it was really peaked when we were traveling in Europe in 2011 with our children and me and Chris, and I was reading, I just happened to be reading while traveling in Europe, The Agony, the Ecstasy by Michelangelo. He was talking about, the figure, and like about releasing it from the stone, and just his love for the figure. And I wasn't doing any of my own figurative or any artwork at the time. I was just being an executive director, and I read that, and I was like, oh my God, I know what this feels like. How am I going to get there from here? How am I ever going to get there from here? I'm so far from this. I'm so far from expertise. I'm so far from practice. I'm so far. I'm this old already. Like, I can't do this. Like, just all the reasons why. No, I can't go there. I can't. And yet it bit me in a way. And so my pursuit of the figure is this, I say I'm besotted with love for the human form, and I really am. Like, and it's not letting me go. So I have a ways to go with whatever I do with it. And because I've not mastered it, I'm getting there. I'm a lot more masterful than I was even a couple of years ago, and that feels really good. And maybe I'll master it to the point where I can let go. Maybe, and that could happen. But I'm not there yet. So I will pursue that mastery until I feel done. And I don't know what form it'll take. It takes the form of, I love doing these miniatures.
I just love them. I could do them forever. And the minute I finish one, I could start another one and just be as fascinated with, you know, the way that these body parts interact as I was, you know, and it just keeps on going and going and going. And I don't know what will become of that, you know, but I can see working with the medium I'm working with now for a while. I'm not anywhere near done with it. And I'll keep on pushing it, you know, and the materials themselves. I mean, these materials that I work with, this cast fabric stuff, 2 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing, and I still, you know, had a show, and there was all this kind of worry because now I know that the materials actually morph after you know, initially cast them, and they need to set for a while, and blah, 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 blah. So these materials are not, like, no one taught me how to use them, and so they're still experimental, but now I know a lot more, and I feel a lot more confident with what I'm doing with them. And I'll always, you know, be pushing, I always feel like I'm pushing the materials. You know, I didn't know I could carve fingers that big from those materials. 2 years ago, I didn't know that. I had like little mitt hands, you know? Now I know I can carve fingers, and now that I know I can carve fingers, I have to carve the damn fingers, you know? It's like, dang, you know, I can't not do that, you know? Now that I know what's possible with the material and kind of, I have to do it, and I'll do it until, you know, I either master it or I can't see anymore, which is, believe it or not, as an artist, you know, getting older, coordination and eyesight are a deal. And maybe I'll be done, maybe I never will be, I don't know. But that's what I'm gonna do right now.